All right, Chris Harrison, thanks so much for joining me today. I appreciate it. Your title is the Healthier Life Coach.
That's right.
And I'm not always interested in hearing how people end up in Dubai and how they got to this point in their life when they're doing something that brings us into a studio where we talk about it. But your situation is, I think, unique. And what adds to that uniqueness is that you talk openly, and something I'm a big fan of, transparently, about what you've done well and where you failed. So tell me a little bit about how you got not just to Dubai today, but how you got to this moment in your life.
Yeah. So thanks for having me. Yeah, it's really quite an interesting one. I'm writing a piece about this at the minute, and the way that I describe it currently is that I'm celebrating 12 years of failure at the minute. And that started when I turned 40. And I realized that I was unhappy and stuck, which is a phrase that I use all the time in what I do and how I speak with people. I help people who are stuck get unstuck. And I was very much at that point when I turned 40. It's really interesting. I kind of remember really distinctly looking in the mirror and not being able to look myself in the eye. Like just something wasn't there. I couldn't make eye contact with myself.
Because you were embarrassed, ashamed?
Yeah, it was a feeling of depression that followed that quite soon afterwards. And that was a point of recognition in me where I realized that I wasn't looking at myself, my body, and I wasn't making eye contact, and I had no conviction. And it really made me realize that I felt low and down and kind of desperate, really. And previous to that point of turning 40, I'd had issues with drink for forever. But it was really interesting because I'd done 9 months of no drink, what I call white knuckling life. So you'd think I'd be in a stronger place, but actually what it did was it just shone a light on all of the deeper issues and problems that I had. You know, I was in not a good marriage. I had 2 kids that I loved dearly. I had a job as a creative, running my own company, working with Virgin, working with big brands, but there was a lot of pressure, there was a lot of burnout, and I work in an industry that for me has always been very up and down, which has been a real big struggle for me to try and manage. 1 minute you're flat out crazy creative in cabs in New York dealing with clients, the next minute there's nothing, and it's really hard to try and balance how you can manage that, especially when you're the sole provider for your family. And I'd reached this point at 40, and I recognised that I couldn't carry on in the same way anymore. So it was at that point that I decided that things needed to change, really.
So I would, at early 40s for me, I went through, and I don't mean to downgrade what it is that you went through, but for me, it was more of a midlife crisis. Mm-hmm. Now, you and I can both relate to this. When we're looking the way that we do, maybe we would go for hair plugs or get a divorce or have an affair or get a sports car, right? For me, I got tattoos. I got a lot of tattoos.
Yeah.
And so for you, you hit that point. It's maybe a midlife crisis. Maybe it sounds like something much more than that as well. And you realize, I'm not comfortable with who I am. I can't look at myself in the mirror. So what was that? Obviously was the most important moment, but how did you then figure out how to climb out of that position that you were in to sort of get to the point where you've changed your life?
It took time. It took time. I think it took me a good 2 years to really get to grips. I started with where I thought, I took the time to look at what was scaring me. I took the time to look at my fears and work out that they were like debilitating me and holding me back. Yeah. So I had fear around relationships. I had fear around my work. I had fear around my health and how I was overweight. I had blood pressure issues. So what I decided to do was try and basically counter what they were. And I I don't know, it was very kind of intuitive at the time, but I was living in Surrey, and I was living in I was living in Reigate. I was living in this setup where I was surrounded by lots of other people with families. And I'd walk through the park feeling miserable, and I would see this group of people just running around like early in the morning doing exercise with these military guys. And that was this thing called British military fitness that started in the UK. And something about it just really appealed to me. And I hated the idea of it, but I couldn't stop watching it. And I just signed myself up and turned up. I went down at 6 o'clock in the morning, and I went out, and I was terrible, like I couldn't breathe, like I was like unfit. But something about that made me feel good afterwards. It was like a rush. And I recognized quite quickly that that was a counter to the fear and the negativity that I was feeling. So I just started hammering that. I really started going for it and turning up to every class, and then making conversations with people. And then I've always been, I think from a very early age, from being very young, I idolized heroes like Clint Eastwood, Arnold Schwarzenegger, people like that. So I was really into like working out, and, I remember buying a set of weights when I was like, 16, 17. So I thought I need to get back into that. And there's something about that appeals to me that I need to do. There's something in this. It makes me feel good. So on reflection, I think the story goes that I kind of used that as a counter against the bad stuff that I knew needed to go away.
So I'm thinking about people who might be listening to this, and they're at that point where they're maybe going through midlife crisis, or maybe they're still dealing with some sort of physical issues. Maybe they're not in the best shape. Maybe they're dealing with addiction issues, whatever the case is. So you get to that point where you don't feel comfortable looking at yourself. You recognize, so there isn't like a journey that's scripted for everyone, I guess. For you, it was a little bit different, where it felt like, or it sounds like, you were sort of groping a little bit for what it was. You knew that things had to change. You saw some physical activity. You thought, okay, I used to do that. I'm going to get back into that. So that's obviously something that's going to make you feel better. Then what was the next step where you realized, okay, I need to maybe start reading, or I need to change, my relationship, or I need to have tough conversations with people in my life? What was, I'm not so much interested in what you did. I'm more interested in what inspired you to recognize. So you explained what it was physically that was inspiration, because you saw these guys out working out in the morning. What was the next thing that you saw, or you realized, I now need to take that next step?
Mm-hmm. I guess I recognized that the relationship, the marriage I was in, was just not good. It wasn't a healthy place for me. So I needed to get out of it. And with that came a lot of pain. And it wasn't easy. Life was made quite difficult for me. I ended up in the bedsit on my own, that kind of scenario, but I was just living in a place where there were a lot of guys going through the same thing. It was like the pattern that you kind of followed. So there was a mini little support network that helped that along the way. So the next thing that happened was, the minute that I decided that the relationship that I was in needed to change and flip, it gave me the independence to start working out what I needed to do next on my own 2 feet.
So you started to sort of map out a plan.
Yes, absolutely.
And do you think how important would you say that is for men today who are trying to figure out, I'm not in the best place?
Yeah, totally. It's being able to define who you are and what you want to be is key. And this is something I say to everybody I work with. When we get stuck and we find ourselves in these positions, we become low. Yeah. And the first thing you look out for is any form of like low mood, or anything in you, like I described, like not being able to look at myself. And you can stay in that pattern for so long, and you exist within that framework. And it's very difficult to break out of that framework. But you start to break it by creating points of action, by points of movement, by doing hard things, by making difficult decisions. And I found personally, as I started to make those difficult decisions, they brought me into a situation where I started to stand on my own 2 feet bit by bit. And then from that, I could start to work out what my next step was. What was my plan next? What was I going to do next?
And you said earlier it took you about 2 years to figure out, I guess, to complete that journey or to know that you're now on a healthier course. So you go through that, and then I guess you end up at a certain point recognizing that you want to give back, you want to help other men. What was it that made you realize, I think I've learned something here? Because you're not, formally trained and educated. A lot of what you're talking about is stuff that you experience. And how did that moment come about where you said, I think I can help others?
So that's come about. Okay, so we talked about midlife crisis. Over the last 2 years, 3 years, I've gone through an identity crisis. And that's where the job that I did, the person I was, a creative, a designer, I mentioned earlier, I always struggled with the up and down roller coaster kind of way that worked. And it's been tough times in the UK and in London currently. And I've seen a lot of my peers and a lot of people more senior to me have ended up in like doing random jobs, like the creative industry is a tough place to be, especially in that kind of middle age. So my identity crisis led to the fact of me thinking I can't carry on working in this off-on fashion anymore. And my heart's not in what I'm doing as a creative. I'm literally just doing the job when it's there. And again, I'm now in a second marriage. We have a mixed family of there's 4 of us all together, there's 6 in the family. So I have a very loving family environment, but I found myself in crisis because my purpose of what I was meant to do, my job, what I was about, was just lost. Really.
So with your family, you have boys. We've spoken before, and you have boys, and you talk a lot about how we should be raising boys today. What is it that you're seeing that made this an important issue for you?
I think we are in quite a confused time at the minute around what the male identity is. I think it's come out of living in confused times, full stop, where everything is questioned and we talk about everything. And we analyze everything, and it makes everything has a question mark over it. I think the male, what a man is, and the male identity has gone through a period of being turned upside down and looked at. And I think that what I see and what I find is I find a lot of guys kind of giving up and not willing to put their necks on the line or put themselves out there in fear of...
Are these men you're talking about or young men?
Men and young men. And I think when you have a man at home who is questioning their identity, then that then will transfer across to the younger men in the environment.
So why do you think that is the case today when maybe, we're close to the same age, where when we were growing up, that might not have been the situation for, what's changed for the father today to make them sort of question what it is that they're all about?
But I think it comes down to, work, having jobs, having that purpose. I think as men, there are lots of men out there who are in difficult work environments at the minute. So that brings pressure back home. The idea of putting yourself out there to coach sports teams, there's a lack of men out there as kind of heroes to young boys, because there's been all sorts of things that have gone on around, guys that, coaching teams are unwilling to do that anymore because fingers have been pointed. We've had lots of scandals and things that have gone on around that. Social media brings a big magnifying glass on people who get involved in this thing. And I think people have been unwilling to put themselves forward. So therefore, young men are lacking these kind of role models in all sorts of places, really. And that has an effect because you need a role model, and a young man, and as he's growing up, a teenager, they need those male role models in their lives. And I think because guys are struggling and guys have been checking out and giving up and feeling low and not knowing how to deal with moods and emotions because of the stresses of society, I think that has a counter effect on the younger guys. It has a counter effect on the teenage sons.
So my father coached me an awful lot when I was younger throughout ice hockey. And I wonder, picking up on what you were saying, because let's look at society today, right? One of the most prevalent aspects, no matter where you go in the world, is social media, right? Everybody's going to have Instagram. It doesn't matter if you're in Europe or the UK, Canada, India, Asia, wherever it is, there's social media and there's Instagram. And so your premise is that men are coaching less, volunteering less, because they are afraid that, as you said, fingers are being pointed. There may be an incident or there may be issues, nothing, untoward, but they just don't want to put themselves out there like they might have in the past, because they know that there could be repercussions for a game being lost. Something as basic as that. Yes, that's the basic premise.
Yeah.
So if that's the case, how is it that we then get men to step into the spotlight again and to pick up some of those coaching opportunities or the volunteering work that they would have done generations ago?
I think we need to redevelop a narrative, and we need to help guys discover what being a man is all about. So I think it's important that we help men understand that we are providers, and we're meant to have a purpose. We're meant to get involved. Yeah, we're meant to be part of the community. As you mentioned, like, this is what your dad did. My dad the same. Yeah, and I think this checking out and this, like, not wanting to be a spotlight or put yourself in a position where you have a magnifying glass on you or you're criticized for the way you deal with children and things like that. I think we're probably out of the other end of that because of the crazy times that we've been through. I think it's important now that we start to rebuild a new narrative that has a much more positive tilt to it, and we help guys understand that it's good to be a man. It's okay to be who you are. It's fine to be masculine. It's fine to be forward thinking and positive and be a leader. Like, get out there and do that again. There are lots of like men's groups out there at the minute that are forming in different places. Like Dubai has a lot of them that are based around exercise and being physical and meeting up and, then having a coffee afterwards and talking. And then all of this stuff builds morale and it builds confidence again, because I believe that we've had our confidence knocked. So
I'm curious. So I agree with all of that. Monday and Friday mornings, I'm on the ice at Dubai Mall. And then you play well, you play poorly, you end up having,
you change. Our ice hockey team down at Dubai Mall. That's amazing.
You change, you shower, and then you sit in a cafe and you have coffee for half an hour before you go off to work. It's one of the best ways to start the day.
Yeah.
And it's very different from when I was in Canada, where you would do that at night and then you would go to the bar or the pub and you would have a drink. This I prefer more. And that team bonding environment after the hockey, I find as I've gotten older, is so much more satisfying. But I'm curious, when you talk about all of these things, talk about masculinity, we talk about the men, what role, where do women fit? Where do girls fit into this? If you're talking about young boys or you're talking about, men our age, where the critics might say, oh, you're trying to build up the men and you're also trying to play down the role of what women should be doing in society. Because we do live in a very different environment than, when our parents, or at least when, our fathers were our age. Roles are not as clearly defined as they once were. So is this something where you're saying men and women have to work together, or I'm not trying to tear down women and build up the men. I'm just trying to focus on what it is that men need to do, because they don't seem to have. And it's also, I'm aware of the fact that we're two white men talking about this, right? I don't know that it's this
white men.
I don't know that we're necessarily able to have this conversation without, women also involved. Mm-hmm. So what is it that you're trying to do where you're focusing on the men, and what sort of words of encouragement or advice do you pass along to men about, the role that women and girls are playing in society and in their lives?
Okay, well, let's give credit where credit's due. You have a daughter of an older age, and I have a 20-year-old daughter. So my first offspring was a girl who I've raised, and then now I'm lumbered with 3 guys to have to deal with and all that goes with it. So I have a very powerful young woman who I've raised, and it's as important to me that she goes into the world and makes a path for herself as it is any guy. I think what's happening at the minute is that the polarization of men and women, which has been created over the last 8 years or so, I would say, has created this separation and this vast gap that falls between. And that's why we now talk about them as being separate issues. And I actually think we should be thinking about how we bring that back together a little bit more. Back to the point of females and women and young women, I think that opportunities have been created for women in the last 10 years. I actually think that's been going on for decades, but I think there's been more power towards it over the last sort of 10 years. And women have totally risen to the challenge and beyond, because women do. Yeah, if I think about my daughter compared to my boys, my daughter independently creates a path for her life, and I have discussions and we review where she's at, and she'll ask my advice. My boys, I have to physically push forward to do things bit by bit. I think what's happened from a career point of view is that you've seen women succeed, and I think you've seen guys kind of give up. And because of the discussions that have been going on around all of these arenas over the last 8 years, I think we've created this polarized kind of men and women scenario, and I think we need to bring that back together again.
So I don't want to speak for my daughter, and I know you wouldn't want to speak for yours, but she and I have very frank conversations. She's back home in Toronto. I have 28-year-old twins, boy and a girl.
Wow.
And I know your daughter is back home in the UK at school. My daughter and I talk, and I think that because she's, in my mind, the ideal woman as a partner and as a friend, because she's a beautiful soul. She's educated, she's smart, she's strong, she's independent. Right? I guess all the things that I value in a woman, which I see also in my wife. Mm-hmm. But I don't know that her future dating life is going to be as opportunistic, because I don't know that there are necessarily the men out there to sort of match her energy. Mm-hmm. From what you would have learned from your daughter, is that something that she thinks about, or that she says, there just aren't the male equals to me?
Oh, you're totally right. That energy, the matching the energy is so true. And I see this with the conversation that we have now, where my daughter will be like in a relationship, and then maybe that will fizzle out because of that reason. I can't, I'm here and he's there. But you see, if you look at like the discussions that go on, like, so there's a writer called Rob Henderson who talks about this quite a lot, about the differences between men and women and the whole dating scenario and everything at the minute. I think women, because they are much further, they're more developed and they are more forward thinking. I mean, a guy is 50% behind in emotional IQ to a woman, right? So I think women are more suited to looking older and further up the ladder to more successful men who are succeeding, and that tends to be the older, slightly older age group. And I think what's happening is the younger guys are falling into this void at the minute of like staying at home and not going out and, you know, playing gaming. And, you know, I hear it a lot. Like I hear a lot of discussion around like in the US at the minute, you know, the reason that the vote was so high for the female demographic for Trump was because there were a lot of mums who are in separated families who have their young men living at home, these guys are like sat on the internet in the basements at the age of 20, 25 and not going out and seeking exercise or, you know, social opportunities because they're in the internet. And like these women are like, we need opportunities to like help me get these guys out and going. And I think what you find is like women will not, they're not going to wait around for those guys to catch up. So there's a massive drop and there's a gap between really, while women are looking older and they're looking higher up the chain really. And that's what's happening a lot at the minute.
Yeah, I don't know if I haven't done the research, so I don't know the statistics. But one of the things that you notice with social media is that there might be trends that have always taken place, but they're more evident now because you're seeing it on social media.
Yeah, more prevalent. Yeah,
and so I will see. To my mind, it feels like there are an awful lot of women in their 20s and early 30s who are dating men, married to men who are much older. Mm-hmm. Now, maybe that's something that has always gone on. I certainly don't remember that, you know, growing up in a suburban Toronto neighborhood. But it feels like it's more prevalent today. And I think it's to your point, right? Which is the women maybe are more ambitious and more driven and more aware of what they want at an earlier age. Mm-hmm. And so they gravitate towards that equal energy. And that's maybe a man who's in his, you know, early 40s, who's, and I'm not talking about the financial games that might be played by men and women. I'm talking about that they're at, you know, a 28-year-old woman and a 36-year-old guy just might be more compatible compared to a 27-year-old woman and a 27-year-old guy.
Yeah.
And you think that that's the case?
Yeah, totally. And I think also what's different to when we were in that situation, people date through apps. Yeah. So like people are on the apps and they're defining what they want before they even get anywhere. So all of a sudden, your demographic of the person you're looking for has gone like this to like nothing. Yeah. So, you know, and again, that comes back to my point about these guys who are maybe in this 20-ish age bracket who are maybe lacking the energy and the push and are using the apps to date and try and find their partners. And you get girls who are using the apps, but with the high standards of I need this and I want that and I want the guy to be like this. So the pool of guys just suddenly gets reduced down to absolutely nothing. You
know, people ask me, you know, we moved out here, my wife and our kids moved out here in 2003, and they'll ask me what the biggest changes that they've seen. The country must have changed, and of course the country has changed so much. You know, Abu Dhabi, we lived in Al Ain, you know, Dubai, but I was coming from Canada and I didn't own my first mobile phone until I moved out here.
Yeah.
And you see so much of life either that you're part of or that's passing you by through your phone now.
Yeah.
And I can remember the old Nokia flip phone, which was my first phone. This is, you know, pre-BlackBerry. And to your point, so much of the dating that goes on now, I have a colleague, for instance, who met his wife through an app. And that seems to be very common nowadays. And in this particular market, in the UAE, in Dubai, you know, there's such a high incidence of mobile phone usage where so many people have more than one.
Yeah.
And they have so many different options.
Yeah.
And I think that having all of those options especially when it's coming to you electronically. You know, you can sit in your room at night and you can just sort of scroll and you can try and find that right partner, as opposed to putting the phone down and going out and trying to engage.
Yeah.
And I think that this gets to something that we talked about earlier, is getting outside your comfort zone, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And doing difficult things, right?
Yeah, I say to my boys, I make my boys like go out. Yeah, and we discussed this before as well. My boys, since coming here, 15 and 16, they will go out on a Friday, Saturday, and they would go on a Sunday, but I've started reeling that in. And they will go and socialise with their friends. They will go to a mall. They will hang out. They will eat food in a restaurant. Yeah, you know, I have the app on my phone with their bank details on, so I can see where they're at. I can see that they're buying food. And, you know, they'll hang out to like 11, 12 o'clock at night, and they'll get an Uber back and come home, or they'll go back to a friend's house. And they are socialising in person, which is not what they were doing in the UK. And also, you know, they're interacting. You know, one of my boys has a girlfriend. You know, it's like... that's how it works. It's like physical interaction. And this is the point of like dating apps and the younger men. Younger men will not go out and put their neck on the line and go out and actually talk to a girl in a bar. You know, there's a fear there already. Yeah. And plus as well, you're doing it already in the app. So why would I need to do that? So there's now, like, guys need to be told now by a girl, like, no, go away. Yeah, you're like, you need to get over that fear factor of the fact that if you're going to go out and you want to attract a female, then you're going to have to go and have some conversations, and you're going to have to go and like do some in-person stuff. And sometimes that's not going to work out. And sometimes somebody's going to tell you to go away, or it's just not going to work. But that's what life is all about. And this is the massive thing that I think is missing. So there is no getting out of a comfort zone in any way or form whatsoever, because everything is inside social media and is inside these apps. So it keeps you in this very contained kind of social media area, I believe.
It was maybe 12 or 15 years ago. We live in the UAE. We're in Dubai. And the government introduced national service for Emirati men. What are your thoughts on national service in general? And if you have any specific ideas about how that would probably help young boys become stronger, more independent, healthier men?
I think it does all of those things. I mean, I read books and I follow quite a few key kind of influencers and writers who are all like ex-military. There's a guy called Jocko Willink. There's famously David Goggins, who most people know about. And I've just mentioned Rob Henderson, who's a psychologist and writer. And these are all people that went through military and came out and then created businesses, or went on to be scholars or authors or writers. And I think the premise of what you get from going through that training is really key. It's really important. It's really, it does a lot for a guy.
Do you think, sorry to interrupt you, do you think it's because of the physical exercise, or is it because of the discipline and the structure, or is it everything?
Discipline and structure. So, you know, back to my point of like when I decided that I was going to turn things around, or if I work with clients, the first thing that I do, the first thing that everybody does that's wrong is that they have no discipline and structure. They have nothing in place. You know, the very age-old instruction of what's the first thing you do when you get up in the morning? Make your bed. Yeah, you know, that these things that you can take for granted and not do when you get low and you get in a depressed state and you get in this kind of static state, like these things are instilled in you from like everything you do through the military process. And I think when it comes back to younger men, I think if younger men are lacking direction and they're lacking inspiration, you know, back to my point again about, you know, I keep hearing about these young guys who are all in their mum's basements in America, yeah? It's like, and in the UK with like no real objective, like work's hard to come by, you know, it's tough. It's tough for them to try and get out there and do things. Like this kind of structure is really really good for them to do. I have a friend in the US who's a bit older than me, who tells a story about how he's got I think 4 kids, and his youngest son was a little bit wayward, and they couldn't get him to like knuckle down, and he lost his way and he got himself into trouble, and he got into his early 20s, and he said, I'm going to sign up, I'm going to go into the military. And he went in for 4 years, and he said like he came out a totally different guy, like totally structured, totally different guy.
You do a lot. You call yourself the healthier life coach. And part of that is physical, going into the gym, moving.
Yeah.
I've discovered that, and I'm big into physical fitness, I've discovered that for me, as I've gotten to this point in my life, I'm 58 now, I still value seeing my abs, even though that's just for me. But I also hugely benefit, I think, on a daily basis when I do exercise from, like, mentally, it helps me almost more now than physically. And for what you do with your clients, I guess it's that combination, right? Where you're trying to almost be a part-time therapist, as well as, a physical trainer. And tell me why, in your experience, you see that there's the physical and the mental benefits to working out.
It's so key. It's the most important element of turning anything around up here is by getting to grips with your body physically and who you are and what you do first. It's the body first, and then that is closely followed by your relationships with other people. And then last of all, it's about how you feel in your head. And when you start to get to grips with your body, and when you start to move, and when you start to create points of action, then you start to make change. Dealing with what goes on up here and who you are as a person is such a big project. I mentioned before, it took me a couple of years to start really getting to grips with who I wanted to be and who I am. In the meantime of doing that, every day I'd go out, I'd hit the gym, I'd run, I'd pound myself, I'd do the reps. And that got more and more, and I got more and more into that, and it became more and more key in my daily routine. And I'd start to feel better. I'd start to lose weight. My blood pressure started to balance out. I started to see my abs. I started to eat a lot better. I started to think about what I was putting inside my body. That's all going on. And that's the key foundation of everything you do. So when I work with clients, the first thing I get everybody doing, no matter who they are, what size they are, man, woman, whatever, the first thing you will do is start a point of movement and exercise. And even the smallest element of that is, it could be just going out and walking every day, doing breath work in the morning, sitting in sunlight, moving outside into an outside space. The impact that has on a person's mental well-being is incredible. And I think we forget that these are the things that we need to do.
Do you think, because we're in Dubai, do you think being here makes it easier or more difficult for us to recognize we need to change our situation? Or do you think that you're going to recognize that no matter where you are?
I think it's the same anywhere. I think we all fall into the same patterns of not doing the work. I call it doing the work. Yeah. Like, doing the work is doing the work on you every day. You have to have a structure in place for your day and how you want that to be from the minute you wake up until the minute you go to bed. And if you can create something that's sustainable for you and makes you feel good, then everything else benefits. Your family relationship benefits, your work benefit, everything. So I think, going back to that idea of when we get stuck, we're stuck because we are literally stuck in ourselves. We're stuck in a very small framework of where we are. Problems, I feel down, everything's on top of me. And by stepping, moving, creating a point of action, moving to another space, moving outside, then you start to set that right. What I do see out here, and the reason why I pivoted to work in this way, the reason why the Healthier Life Coach name came about, I see a country, I see a place where everybody wants to be moving and wants to be out. It's a great place for activity. And I don't know if maybe the constant blue sky and the heat probably helps with that, definitely. But I live on the Palm. I live on the Shoreline Apartments, and I spend a lot of time on Golden Mile. And from day one, I've been blown away by how you go out there and you see kids playing football in the evenings, little groups, like little Tai Chi classes going on, little yoga classes going on, people running around the track. And, it's a hive of activity. So there's a real good approach towards that, I think, here. There's lots of clubs and gyms and places to work out. There's lots of opportunities. But then I still see that people are stuck. Yeah, and they're stuck inside those apartments. When you're in that situation and you're in the funk and you need to try and get out of it, it's very hard to see what's going on outside your room, really.
Yeah, I would challenge a little bit of what you said there. I do wonder, and I've been out here for a long time, so I don't know the conversations happening in other cities around the world. But here there seems to be, and it's just my experience, but I feel like there are more conversations taking place here in Dubai about certainly physical health than in other parts. I would love to know the numbers, but it feels like there are so many people who are personal trainers, and I would think that the number of personal trainers per capita here, it feels like it's more than it is in other parts of the world.
Yeah,
and it could be. Sorry.
Yeah, there are a lot. There's big numbers.
Yes, and it could be because of the weather, right? It is. I come from Canada. 6 months out of the year, you're probably stuck inside because it's too cold. Here, you're stuck inside maybe because it's too hot. But I like the heat, so the heat doesn't bother me from going out, especially even on the hottest days. Usually in the morning and usually at night, there'll be a little bit of a break so that you can be out. Whereas in Canada, if it's cold, it's cold. It doesn't matter if it's the morning or the evening. But here, the conversations that take place around mental health, and I'm talking about, maybe my friends and whatnot, some of them I think are from global trends, like the ice baths, for instance. That seems to be something that's happening around the world. Yeah. And maybe it's because here you don't have the same opportunities to layer with clothes because there is no cold. Yeah. And so there's more vulnerability, right? Because you're more in shorts or T-shirts. And if you're not in the shape that you want to be, you don't get a season to hide it. And I agree that there are so many opportunities for men and women and children as well here in the country. And, activities like I play hockey, I can do it all year round. And that's not always the case back home, or at least it wasn't when I was there. So as we start to wind down this conversation, what is it that you think men need to start doing more of if they're questioning what it is, if they're going through something where they're not feeling they're on their top of the game? It could be a midlife crisis, or it could just be I'm in a bit of a funk. As you said, I'm stuck. What are some pieces of advice? What is it that they should be watching or reading or listening to sort of help them recognize that maybe something has to change?
Yeah, I think the first thing that guys need to do, I think the first thing that men need to do, women need to do, anybody needs to do who feels like they're in that situation, is recognize that nobody is coming to save you. Yeah, this is on you. Yeah, it's up to you to recognize and identify that you need a purpose and you need to do more with your life. And there's a couple of ways you can seek help on that. You can go down the route of therapy. If you wanted to dig in deep into what that's about, you could employ somebody like a coach or a life coach like myself, who maybe bridges the gap between being physical and what you do around life and work and health. And if you really are like in a situation where it's difficult to access any of these, there are groups that you can go to, like men's groups, women's groups, and go and meet and actually talk with other people and interact and recognize that we need each other to be able to build a purpose. So I think, like guys, like, you know what you need to do. You know how you feel in yourself. If you feel low, if you feel like you're not doing enough, then have that conversation with yourself. Yeah, have that difficult conversation. Recognize that you're not in a good place and take responsibility for yourself, and realize that you need to start putting one foot in front of the other to move forward and ask for help. Yeah, it's vulnerability. To be vulnerable is fine as a man. It's good. We should do that. We should be open to that. But just because we become vulnerable doesn't mean that we need to give up. Yeah, it means that we can be vulnerable. We can show emotion. We can ask for help. But then we should start to recognize that we can reframe back to being those people that our family needs. A man shouldn't feel like a liability to his family. Yeah, he shouldn't feel like he can't provide, because what happens when a man gets in that situation is he gets down. Yeah, and I speak from experience with this. Like, this was my identity crisis over the last couple of years, being in a really great situation, with a wife that works and is successful, but me being in a position where I couldn't make those connections. And it brought me to that point of getting down again. Yeah, it brought me to that lull and that low, because my purpose was confused and lost. And that's the hole that we fall into as men, is when we lose focus on what our purpose is. So we should ask for help. We should, review ourselves. We should have those difficult conversations, because, like anything, you tend to find that it's the start that stops us from moving forward.
Chris, thank you so much for joining me.
Cool. Thank you.